The overwhelming cacophony of the chaotic charity gala, a swirling vortex of clinking crystal flutes, and forced, high-pitched laughter that scraped against my sensitive ears like sandpaper, was the first indication that I had made a terrible mistake in coming here tonight. I had spent the last 5 years of my life in the hushed, dust-mote-filled silence of the archival restoration room at the city library, surrounded by the comforting scent of decaying paper and binding glue. So being thrust into this sea of sequins and predatory socialites felt akin to a lamb wandering inadvertently into a den of well-groomed wolves. The air in the ballroom was thick with expensive perfume that masked the scent of desperation, cloying and heavy, sticking to the back of my throat as I maneuvered through the throngs of people who looked through me as if I were nothing more than a ghost haunting the periphery of their opulent lives. Desperation to escape the suffocating noise clawed at my chest, a physical ache that drove me toward the grand mahogany doors of the cloakroom, where a harried attendant with frantic eyes was drowning in a sea of cashmere and fur. The storm outside had been raging for hours, lashing against the floor-to-ceiling windows with a violence that made the chandeliers tremble, and the line to retrieve coats was a disorderly, shoving mass of impatient, wealthy patrons who seemed to believe their comfort was more important than basic human decency. I simply wanted my beige trench coat, a thrift store find that I had meticulously cleaned and mended, so I could slip out the side exit and vanish back into the obscurity where a woman like Sienna Rain belonged. When I finally reached the counter, the young girl behind it looked on the verge of tears, her hands trembling as she grabbed a ticket from a shouting man. So when I spotted a beige trench coat hanging precariously on the edge of the rack near the counter, identical to mine in color and cut, I made a split-second decision that would ultimately dismantle my entire existence. I reached over the velvet rope while her back was turned, my fingers curling into the fabric that felt heavier and arguably more luxurious than the polyester blend I was used to. And I pulled it down, turning on my heel to weave through the crowd before anyone could accuse me of impatience or theft. I shoved my arms into the sleeves as I pushed through the heavy exit doors, the silk lining cool against my skin, though I barely registered that the fit was slightly too large in the shoulders, encompassing me in a way that felt strangely protective yet ominous. The moment I stepped out onto the slick, rain-lashed pavement of the side street, the wind whipped my hair across my face, blinding me momentarily as the icy deluge soaked through my thin dress, making me grateful for the heavy coat I had snatched. I turned my collar up against the biting chill, burying my nose into the fabric, and that was when the first anomaly struck me, not the scent of my lavender laundry detergent, but a dark, intoxicating blend of sandalwood, expensive tobacco, and something sharp and metallic that smelled dangerously like ozone before a lightning strike. Before I could process why my coat smelled like a man who walked through shadows for a living. A vibration buzzed violently against my right hip, a jarring sensation that made me jump and nearly slip on the wet cobblestones. Confusion knit my brow, because I knew my phone was in my clutch purse, which was currently tucked under my arm. Yet the vibration persisted, demanding and angry, originating from the deep inner pocket of the trench coat I was wearing. My hand dove inside automatically, my fingers brushing against cold, hard metal, before wrapping around a sleek, disposable burner phone that was flashing with an unknown number. The rational part of my brain, the part that meticulously glued pages back into 16th century Bibles, screamed at me to drop the device and run. But curiosity is a treacherous, seductive beast that overrides survival instincts with frightening ease. I slid the button to answer and brought the device to my ear, intending to explain that there had been a mix-up at the coat check. But the voice that poured into my ear froze the breath in my lungs and halted my heart in its frantic rhythm. "Change of plans, V," the voice said, and it was a sound that commanded the very air around me to still, a deep, resonant baritone that wrapped around my spine like barbed wire, smooth as velvet yet edged with the promise of unimaginable violence. "Bring the ledger to the West Docks, Warehouse 4. You have 20 minutes, or I burn the city down with you in it." I tried to speak, to stammer out an apology, to say, "I'm sorry, I'm just Sienna. I restore books. I think I took the wrong coat." But my vocal cords were paralyzed by the sheer, unadulterated menace radiating from the other end of the line. The man didn't wait for a response, clearly accustomed to his orders being followed without question or hesitation, and the line went dead with a finality that felt like a gavel striking a death sentence. I stood there in the pouring rain, the phone still pressed to my ear, staring blankly at the dark alleyway ahead of me while the water ran down my neck and soaked into the collar of a coat that belonged to someone named V, someone who was clearly involved in something illegal and terrifying. Trembling, not just from the cold, but from a terror that was rapidly expanding in my gut, I lowered the phone and shoved it back into the pocket. But as I did, my knuckles grazed the object I had felt earlier, the cold, hard metal that I had dismissed in my haste. I reached back in, my hand shaking so violently I could barely grip the object, and pulled it out into the dim light of the street lamp, a gasp tearing from my throat that sounded more like a sob. It was a gun, sleek, black, and heavy, looking terrifyingly lethal in my ink-stained hand, and wrapped around the handle was a white silk handkerchief that was stained with dark, crusting crimson blood. I nearly dropped it, the realization crashing over me like a tidal wave. I was standing on a public street holding a murder weapon and a phone that had just delivered a threat from a man who sounded like the devil himself, wearing a coat that likely belonged to a criminal or a killer. Panic, irrational and blinding, seized me, spinning my thoughts into a chaotic frenzy where I imagined police sirens wailing, handcuffs snapping around my wrists, and a lifetime in a cell because no one would believe that the quiet girl from the library hadn't just shot someone and stolen their coat. If I went to the police, I would be found with the weapon. If I went back to the gala, the owner of the coat, V, might be waiting, and based on the blood on the handkerchief, he wasn't the type to ask politely for his property back. Logic warped under the pressure of fear, twisting into a grotesque shape that told me there was only one way to survive this night without ending up in prison or dead in a ditch. The man on the phone, the boss clearly, expected the coat and the ledger at the West Docks, and if I showed up and handed over the coat, explaining through tears that it was a terrible accident, perhaps he would see that I was just a harmless civilian and let me go. It was a stupid, naive, horrifyingly optimistic plan, born of a mind that had read too many adventure novels where the misunderstanding is cleared up in the final act, ignoring the reality that in the genre of life I had just stumbled into, misunderstandings were usually resolved with a bullet to the head. I flagged down a passing taxi, my movements jerky and frantic, and threw myself into the back seat, tucking the gun deep into the folds of the coat so the driver wouldn't see. "West Docks," I whispered, my voice sounding hollow and foreign to my own ears. The driver eyed me in the rearview mirror, his gaze lingering on the expensive trench coat that looked so out of place on my shivering form, but he merely grunted and pulled away from the curb, driving me away from the safety of the city center and toward the industrial wasteland that lined the river. The ride was a blur of neon lights streaking across the rain-streaked windows, counting down the minutes of my life, each second ticking away, bringing me closer to the monster who had threatened to burn the city down. I clutched the coat tighter around me, ironically seeking comfort from the very object that had doomed me, inhaling that scent of sandalwood and smoke, trying to imagine the face of the man who owned it. Was he cruel? Was he old? Or was he something worse? A man with a voice that could seduce you into walking willingly into your own grave? The taxi dropped me off at the entrance to the docks, the driver refusing to go any further into the labyrinth of shipping, containers and rusted cranes, leaving me standing in the mud as the taillights faded into the mist. The West Docks were a graveyard of industry, silent save for the groaning of metal in the wind and the rhythmic slapping of dark water against the pilings, a place where shadows seemed to possess a physical weight. I checked the burner phone. I had 4 minutes left. Walking toward Warehouse 4 felt like walking underwater, every step heavy and resistant, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard I thought it might bruise the bone, a frantic drumbeat of run, run, run that I forced myself to ignore. The warehouse loomed ahead, a massive, decaying structure of corrugated metal with a gaping maw of a sliding door that was cracked open just enough to reveal a sliver of darkness deeper than the night surrounding it. I shouldn't be here. I should be at home with a cup of tea, reading a book on medieval binding techniques, not clutching a blood-stained gun in a coat that cost more than my annual salary. But I was here, propelled by the terrifying certainty that if I didn't face the man on the phone, he would hunt me down, and I would rather face the demon I could see than the one hiding in the shadows. I reached the heavy iron doors, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps that misted in the frigid air, and I pushed against the rusted metal, the screech of the hinges sounding like a scream in the silence. I stepped inside, the darkness swallowing me whole, the smell of oil, rust, and damp earth filling my nostrils, and for a moment, I saw nothing but the vast emptiness of the cavernous space. Then, a singular spotlight clicked on in the center of the warehouse, blindingly bright, cutting through the gloom to illuminate a solitary wooden chair in the middle of the concrete floor. "You're late," the voice from the phone echoed from everywhere and nowhere, bouncing off the steel walls, vibrating through the soles of my shoes. I froze, the coat feeling suddenly like a lead weight, and as my eyes adjusted to the glare, I realized with a jolt of pure, distilled terror that I wasn't alone, and that coming here had not been an act of bravery, but a suicide mission. From the shadows behind the light, a figure detached itself from the darkness. A man, tall, broad-shouldered, and emanating a lethal stillness that made the hair on my arms stand up. And as he stepped into the halo of the light, I saw the glint of a gun in his hand, leveled directly at my chest. I had walked straight into the lion's den, wearing the skin of the jackal he intended to kill, and as the heavy metal door slammed shut behind me with a resounding boom, sealing my fate, I knew there would be no explaining my way out of this. I think I have your coat," I whispered into the silence, the words sounding pathetic and small against the overwhelming force of the man walking toward me. He didn't stop. He didn't blink. He just kept coming. A predator who had finally trapped his prey. And as he raised the weapon to align with my forehead, I realized that the mistake I made at the coat check was going to cost me everything. The cold, unforgiving steel of the gun barrel pressed against the center of my forehead was a sensation so absolute, so finalizing, that it seemed to pause the rotation of the earth itself, suspending me in a terrifying moment where my entire history, the quiet nights restoring vellum, the smell of old paper, the safe predictability of my solitary existence, evaporated into the damp, metallic air of the warehouse. I dared not breathe, fearing that the simple expansion of my lungs might be interpreted as an act of aggression by the man standing before me, a man whose eyes were not the windows to a soul, but rather abysses of crushed obsidian that swallowed the dim light and promised nothing but an agonizing end to my short, unremarkable life. He was a monolith of violence carved from shadows and tailored suits, his presence so overwhelming that it sucked the oxygen from the cavernous space, leaving me lightheaded and trembling as the rain dripped from the hem of the stolen trench coat to pool around my feet like tears I was too paralyzed to shed. "I asked you a question," he murmured, his voice a low, vibrating rumble that traveled through the floorboards and up my spine, deceptively calm, yet laced with the kind of lethal authority that monarchs and executioners wielded before swinging the axe. "You have 3 seconds to tell me where the ledger is, or I will paint this concrete with your brains and find it myself." My mouth opened, but the words were stuck in a throat constricted by primal terror, forcing me to swallow the scream that was clawing its way up my esophagus. Because how does one explain to a man who looks like death incarnate that a mix-up at a charity coat check has led to this catastrophic misunderstanding? I tried to raise my hands in surrender, a gesture of universal submission, but the movement caused the heavy fabric of the coat to shift, and the gun I had foolishly tucked into the pocket clattered against the side of the shipping container I was backed against, the sound echoing like a thunderclap in the silence. The man's eyes flickered down to the pocket, his expression hardening from suspicion to confirmed malice. And before I could even stutter a denial, he closed the distance between us with terrifying speed, his hand wrapping around my throat to slam me back against the rusted corrugated metal. "You come here armed, wearing his coat, answering his phone, and you expect me to believe you're just a confused civilian?" He snarled, his face inches from mine, close enough that I could see the faint, jagged scar running through his left eyebrow and smell the intoxicating, dangerous blend of rainwater, expensive scotch, and gunpowder that clung to his skin. "You must think I'm a fool, V, or whoever you are working for thinks I've gone soft, sending a woman to do a job that requires a butcher." I clawed uselessly at the hand compressing my windpipe, my vision spotting with black bursts of light, gasping for air as I tried to force the truth past his crushing grip. "I'm not V," I choked out, tears finally spilling over my lashes to mix with the rain on my cheeks, hot tracks of fear running down my cold skin. "My name is Sienna. I took the wrong coat. Please look at me, I'm nobody." He didn't release me, but the pressure on my throat eased just enough to allow a ragged breath to sear into my burning lungs, though his gun never wavered from its target between my eyes. He studied my face with a clinical, terrifying intensity, dissecting my features as if he were looking for a wire, a mask, or a deceit hidden in the trembling curve of my lip. And for a fleeting second, I saw a flicker of confusion disrupt the icy perfection of his glare. I was not the hardened criminal he expected. I was a librarian in a cocktail dress under a man's trench coat, soaking wet and hyperventilating. But in his world, innocence was likely just another costume worn by assassins and thieves. "If you are nobody," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper that was somehow more terrifying than his shout, "then why did you answer the phone?" It was the question that sealed my coffin, the damning evidence of my own curiosity. And as I stammered through the explanation, how the phone had rung, how I had instinctively answered it in the chaos of the storm, how his voice had compelled me to come here, I saw the walls of his skepticism harden rather than crumble. He reached into the pocket of the coat with his free hand, not the one holding my life in check with a trigger pull, and extracted the black gun wrapped in the bloody handkerchief, holding it up to the light with a sneer of disgust. "This is V's piece," he stated flatly, tossing the weapon away as if it burned him, the metal skittering across the concrete floor into the shadows. "And this is V's blood, which means either you killed him, or you're the replacement he sent because he knew I was coming for him tonight." "I found it in the pocket!" I cried out, my voice cracking under the strain of his accusation. "I haven't killed anyone. I restore antique books for a living. I don't even know how to use a gun." He leaned in closer, his body pressing mine into the hard, unrelenting ridges of the shipping container, his heat leaching into my frozen frame in a confusing, terrifying intimacy that made my heart race for reasons beyond fear. "Books," he repeated, the word tasting like ash in his mouth. "You expect me to believe a book restorer infiltrated my private line, secured the drop location, and showed up at the exact time I specified, all by accident?" The absurdity of it hung in the air between us, and I realized with a sinking, nauseating clarity that the truth was too strange to be believed by a man who lived in a world of conspiracies and betrayals. He abruptly pulled away, holstering his weapon in a fluid motion beneath his jacket, though the threat of violence didn't diminish. It merely shifted from immediate execution to something far more prolonged and sinister. He grabbed my wrist, his fingers circling the delicate bones like manacles of flesh and bone, and began dragging me toward the gaping exit of the warehouse, his stride long and purposeful, while I stumbled and slipped on the wet concrete trying to keep up. "Where are you taking me?" I screamed, digging my heels into the ground in a futile attempt to resist the inexorable force of his momentum. But he was an unstoppable tide, and I was merely driftwood caught in his current. "You claim innocence, Sienna," he said, saying my name with a mocking lilt that sent shivers down my spine. "So I'm going to give you a chance to prove it, but not here, not where your backup might be waiting in the rafters with a sniper rifle." He dragged me out into the relentless downpour, the rain plastering my hair to my skull and soaking through the coat instantly, and marched me toward a sleek, black-armored SUV idling in the shadows like a beast waiting to be fed. The driver's door opened before we even reached it, and a burly man with a shaved head stepped out, looking from me to the man holding me with a questioning grunt, but my captor merely jerked his head toward the back seat. "She's the new variable," he told the driver, his voice fighting the roar of the wind. "Drive us to the tower. If she's lying about the ledger, I want to be somewhere soundproof when I extract the truth from her." The words "extract the truth" conjured images of torture so vivid and horrific that my knees buckled, and I would have collapsed into the mud had he not hauled me upright and shoved me into the leather interior of the car. The door slammed shut, sealing out the noise of the storm and trapping me in a quiet, leather-scented cage with the most dangerous man in the city. He slid in beside me, filling the space with his overwhelming presence, and as the car peeled away from the docks, lurching over potholes before smoothing out onto the tarmac, I pressed myself against the window, watching the warehouse shrink into the distance, wishing I was back inside facing a bullet rather than whatever awaited me at the tower. Silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating, broken only by the rhythmic swish of the windshield wipers and the frenetic beating of my own heart, which felt like a trapped bird battering itself against my ribs. I risked a glance at him. He was staring straight ahead, his profile sharp and cruel against the passing streetlights, one hand resting casually on his thigh while the other held a phone to his ear. "Clean the warehouse," he ordered into the device, his tone devoid of emotion. "And find out who V was contacting before he went dark. I have a woman here who claims she's a civilian, but she's wearing his coat and reeks of his failure." He hung up and slowly turned his head to look at me, his gaze traveling over my shivering form, lingering on my hands which were clutching the lapels of the coat so tightly my knuckles were white. The adrenaline that had sustained me was beginning to crash, replaced by a bone-deep cold and a trembling that shook the entire seat. And to my shock, he reached out and turned up the climate control, a small, confusing act of mercy in the midst of a kidnapping. "You're shaking," he observed, not with concern, but with the detached curiosity of a scientist watching a specimen react to stimuli. "Is it the cold, or is it the realization that you've walked into a game you don't understand?" "I'm not playing a game," I whispered, my teeth chattering uncontrollably. "I just want to go home." He laughed then, a dark, humorless sound that felt like sandpaper on raw skin. "Home is a concept for people who don't get involved with the Kale Syndicate. Once you answered that phone, you forfeited your right to go home, because now my enemies know your voice, and they will burn your little book restoration shop to the ground just to get to me." The reality of his words settled over me like a shroud. I wasn't just a captive. I was collateral damage in a war I didn't know existed. A loose end that had tied itself into a knot around a Mafia don's finger. We drove through the city, the skyline rising up like jagged teeth against the night sky, until the car slowed before a massive, glass-walled skyscraper that pierced the clouds, a fortress of wealth and power that looked impenetrable. The car descended into an underground garage, the heavy steel gates clanging shut behind us, with the finality of a prison door. And I knew in that moment that Sienna Rain, the girl who loved quiet evenings and old books, had died back at the coat check, replaced by a prisoner of circumstance. He hauled me out of the car, his grip firm but less violent than before, and guided me toward a private elevator, punching in a security code with practiced ease. As the elevator ascended, the numbers climbing higher and higher, my ears popped, and the air grew thin, reflecting the dizzying height of my predicament. When the doors finally slid open, revealing a sprawling penthouse that looked more like a museum of cold marble and stark modern art than a home. He stepped out and pulled me into his world. He turned to me, the city lights reflecting in his dark eyes, and for the first time he saw the ink stains on my fingers. Blue and black smudges from the 17th century manuscript I had been working on earlier that day. He took my hand, lifting it to inspect the stains, his thumb brushing over the rough skin in a touch that was electric and terrifyingly gentle. "Ink," he murmured, his eyes narrowing as the pieces of my story began to grate against his paranoia. "Perhaps you are telling the truth, little bird." Hope flared in my chest, bright and desperate. "I am. Please, just let me—" "But," he interrupted, his grip tightening as he pulled me closer, until I could feel the heat radiating from his chest. "In my experience, the most innocent-looking things are often the most poisonous, and until I find that ledger, you belong to me." Just then, the phone in his pocket, my phone, which he must have taken from my clutch while I was unconscious to the world in the car, began to ring, the cheerful, generic melody sounding grotesque in the tension-filled room. He pulled it out, looking at the screen with a dark, predatory smile that made my blood run cold, before turning the screen toward me so I could see the caller ID. It was unknown, but beneath it, a text message flashed across the screen. "We know you have the girl. Hand her over, or we send her fingers to you one by one." He looked at me, the smile vanishing, replaced by a mask of cold, possessive fury that promised violence on a biblical scale. "It seems," he said, locking the elevator down with a remote command, ensuring there was no escape, "that you are far more valuable than a simple antique restorer, and now that they want you, I have no intention of letting you go." The elevator doors slid shut with a pneumatic hiss that sounded tragically like the sealing of a tomb, severing the last tenuous thread connecting me to the world of sanity, streetlights, and freedom, leaving me trapped in a rapidly ascending metal box, with a man who radiated danger the way a star radiates heat, constant, overwhelming, and capable of burning me to ash if I dared to step too close. My heart, which had been hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs since the moment I picked up that cursed phone, now felt as though it were expanding to fill my entire chest, choking off my air supply as the floor numbers on the digital display climbed higher and higher, taking me away from the solid earth and up into the rarefied, oxygen-deprived atmosphere where monsters like Draven Kale built their nests. He stood with his back to the mirrored wall, watching me through the reflection with eyes that were devoid of human empathy, calculating my value and my potential for treachery, with the cold, mathematical precision of a predator, deciding whether to toy with its food or go straight for the throat. When the doors finally opened, revealing the penthouse that spanned the entire top floor of the tower, I was struck not by the opulence, which was undeniable in the sprawling expanse of Italian marble floors and modern art that looked like violent slashes of paint on canvas, but by the profound, echoing emptiness of the space, a sterile, temperature-controlled void that felt less like a home and more like a high-security vault designed to keep the world out and the secrets within. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city, battered by the storm, the rain lashing against the reinforced glass in sheets of gray and black. But instead of feeling like a view of freedom, the city below looked like a distant, unreachable memory, a glittering map of a life I had lost the moment I put on the wrong coat. "Welcome to the cage, little bird," Draven murmured, his voice a low vibration that seemed to wrap around my spine, and he stepped out of the elevator, moving with a fluid, predatory grace that made me think of a panther stalking through a jungle, leaving me no choice but to follow him because the elevator required a key card I didn't possess, and staying behind meant waiting for his patience to snap. He led me into a living area that was dominated by a fireplace long enough to roast a man whole, though it was currently cold and dark, and gestured vaguely toward a low, black leather sofa that looked as inviting as a slab of granite. I sat on the edge of the cushion, my knees pressed together, clutching the lapels of the stolen trench coat as if it could shield me from his piercing gaze. But he didn't sit. Instead, he began to circle the room, removing his jacket and tossing it onto a chair, revealing the holster strapped to his chest and the white dress shirt that strained against the muscles of his shoulders, looking for all the world like a man preparing for a dissection. "You have a very specific scent," he said suddenly, stopping behind the sofa so his voice drifted over my shoulder, close enough that the fine hairs on my neck stood on end. "Most people who sit where you are sitting smell like fear, sweat, bile, adrenaline. And while you certainly reek of terror, there is something else underneath it. Something old and dusty like a church or a grave. And I am trying to decide if it is a perfume chosen to disarm me or the scent of where you have been hiding the ledger." I closed my eyes, trying to summon a shred of the courage that had allowed me to survive alone in the city for 5 years, and forced myself to speak, my voice trembling, but audible in the acoustically perfect room. "It's not a perfume and it's not a hiding place. It's paper dust, binding glue, and decaying leather because, as I told you in the warehouse before you kidnapped me, I am an antique book restorer, not a criminal mastermind, and the only ledgers I handle are from the 18th century, detailing grain shipments in obscure French villages." He moved around the sofa to stand in front of me, blocking the light from the city, casting a long, imposing shadow over my huddled form, and tilted his head to the side, studying me with a mixture of skepticism and a dark, budding curiosity that was infinitely more terrifying than his anger. "A book restorer," he repeated, rolling the words around in his mouth as if tasting them for poison, his eyes dropping to my hands, which were still stained with the indigo ink I had been using to retouch a faded manuscript earlier that afternoon. "You expect me to believe that a woman who spends her days with glue and old paper just happened to intercept a secure communication from a dead drop, navigated to a cartel-controlled shipping yard, and managed to look exactly like the kind of innocent distraction my enemies would send to lower my guard?" "It was the coat!" I cried out, frustration warring with fear as I gestured wildly to the oversized beige fabric enveloping me. "I was at the gala. The cloakroom was a disaster. I grabbed this coat because it looked like mine, and when the phone rang I answered it because I thought it might be the owner calling to get it back. But then you threatened to burn the city down and I panicked." Draven leaned down, placing his hands on the arms of the chair, trapping me within the cage of his body, his face inches from mine so that I was forced to look into the abyss of his eyes, seeing the flecks of gold hidden in the blackness. "Panic makes people run, Sienna," he whispered, using my name again with that terrifying familiarity that made my stomach flip. "Panic makes people go to the police, or hide in a bathroom, or call their mothers. Panic does not make a civilian woman drive to the West Docks at midnight to negotiate with a man known as the Reaper, unless that woman possesses a spine made of steel, or a motive she isn't sharing." "I thought I could explain," I insisted, breathless from his proximity. The scent of him, whiskey, rain, and danger, overwhelming my senses and making it hard to think straight. "I thought if I gave you the coat and the gun, you would see it was a mistake and let me go, but I didn't know you were this." "And what am I?" he asked softly, his gaze dropping to my lips for a fraction of a second before snapping back to my eyes, the air between us crackling with a tension that was thick, heavy, and undeniably electric. "You're the man who is going to kill me for a mistake I didn't mean to make," I whispered, the truth of the statement hanging between us like a guillotine blade, because despite his moments of curiosity, I knew that men like him didn't leave loose ends, and I was the loosest end of all. He stared at me for a long, agonizing moment, his expression unreadable, and then, slowly, deliberately, he reached out and took my left hand, his calloused fingers wrapping around my wrist with a surprising gentleness that contradicted the violence inherent in his nature. He lifted my hand to the light, inspecting the blue stains on my fingertips, the small cuts from paper edges, the dryness of my skin from handling chemicals, treating my hand as if it were one of the artifacts I restored. something fragile, puzzling, and potentially valuable. "These stains," he murmured, running his thumb over the pad of my index finger, sending a jolt of electricity shooting up my arm that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the confusing, dark magnetism of the man holding me captive. "This is iron gall ink, isn't it? The kind that burns through paper over centuries if not neutralized." I stared at him, my mouth falling open in shock, because hearing a Mafia Don identify a specific type of archaic ink was so incongruous with the gun on the table and the threat against my life that I momentarily forgot to breathe. How do you know that?" "I know a great many things, Sienna," he replied, his eyes darkening as he released my hand but didn't pull away, staying in my personal space, looming over me like a storm cloud. "I know that fear dilates the pupils, which yours are doing. I know that lying increases the heart rate, which I can see pulsing in your carotid artery. And I know that no assassin in the world would have fingernails cut this short or hands this rough from labor, because vanity is an assassin's secondary trade." He straightened up, the oppressive weight of his physical presence lifting slightly, though the psychological pressure remained crushing. "You might be telling the truth," he admitted, the words spoken with a reluctance that suggested he hated being wrong almost as much as he hated betrayal. "You might just be the unluckiest woman in this city, a little bird who flew into a hurricane and mistook it for a breeze." Relief washed over me, so intense it made me dizzy, and I let out a shaky breath, tears of gratitude pricking my eyes. "Then you'll let me go?" I asked, hope blooming in my chest like a fragile flower in winter. "If you believe me, you'll let me go home?" Draven walked over to a wet bar made of black obsidian and poured himself a glass of amber liquid, his back to me, the muscles of his shoulders shifting under his shirt as he took a slow, contemplative sip. "I didn't say that," he said, turning back to face me, his expression hardening again, the brief moment of connection severed by the cold reality of his world. "Believing you are innocent doesn't change the fact that you know where my warehouse is, you know my face, and you have heard my voice giving orders that would send me to prison for life. Innocence is not a shield in my world, Sienna. It is a liability." Before I could protest, before I could beg or scream or try to run for the elevator that I knew was locked, a shrill ringing cut through the silence of the penthouse. Not the burner phone I had answered, but a sleek smartphone sitting on the marble counter. Draven picked it up, swiping the screen and putting it on speaker without taking his eyes off me, his gaze pinning me to the sofa, as effectively as physical bonds. "Report," he commanded, his voice shifting instantly from the smoky, intimate tone he had used with me to the hard, jagged steel of a commander addressing his troops. "We found V," a voice crackled through the speaker, distorted by static, but clear enough to convey the grimness of the message. "Or what's left of him. They fished him out of the river an hour ago near the east docks, throat slit, tongue cut out." The blood drained from my face so fast I thought I might faint, the room spinning as the brutal reality of what I had stepped into crashed down on me. The man who owned the coat, the V I had been impersonating, had been butchered, and I was wearing his clothes. Draven didn't flinch, his face a mask of stone, but his eyes narrowed, focusing on me with renewed intensity. "If V has been dead for hours," he said, his voice dangerously calm, "then who sent the message about the drop?" "That's the bad news, boss," the voice on the phone continued, sounding hesitant for the first time. "We traced the signal that pinged the burner phone the girl answered. It didn't come from V's network. It came from the Russo family." The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush bones. Draven ended the call and slowly placed the phone back on the counter, the click of the device against the marble echoing like a gunshot in the vast room. He looked at me, but the curiosity was gone, replaced by a dark, terrifying possessiveness that made my skin crawl and my heart race in a chaotic rhythm of fear and anticipation. "Do you understand what this means, Sienna?" he asked, walking toward me again. But this time his stride wasn't predatory. It was claiming. I shook my head, mute with terror, shrinking back into the leather sofa. "It means," he said, stopping right in front of me and reaching down to grip my chin, tilting my face up so I couldn't look away from the fire burning in his eyes, "that the phone call wasn't a mistake. It was a trap set for me, and by answering it, you triggered the mechanism." I don't understand," I stammered, tears spilling over my cheeks, hot and fast. "The Russos killed V," he explained, his thumb brushing away a tear with a roughness that felt like a brand. "They knew I was waiting for the ledger, so they planted the phone, hoping one of my men would pick it up, giving them a target to track back to me, but instead they got you." He leaned closer, his breath ghosting over my lips, smelling of whiskey and impending doom. "They tracked that phone to the warehouse, and then they tracked my car to this tower. They think you are my new informant, my new V, and because you are here in my home under my protection, they will assume you are the keeper of all my secrets." "But I'm not," I sobbed, the horror of it suffocating me. "I'm nobody. Tell them I'm nobody." "It doesn't matter what you are," Draven growled, his voice dropping to a register that vibrated through my very bones. "It only matters what they think you are, and right now, they think you are the key to bringing down my empire, which means they will stop at nothing to capture you, torture you, and kill you just to get to me." He pulled me up from the sofa, his grip on my arms bruising, forcing me to stand, forcing me to face the reality that my life as Sienna Rain, the quiet book restorer, was over, incinerated by a single phone call. "You wanted to go home?" he asked, his eyes searching mine, dark and relentless. "Your home is a kill zone now. If you step foot in your apartment, you will be dead within the hour." I trembled in his grasp, my legs weak, my mind fracturing under the weight of his words, realizing that the cage I thought I was in was actually the only thing standing between me and a gruesome death. "So," Draven said, pulling me against his hard chest, one hand tangling in my hair to tilt my head back, exposing my throat to him in a gesture of utter vulnerability. "You are not a prisoner, Sienna. You are a target, and I am the only shield you have left." He leaned down, his lips brushing the shell of my ear, sending a shiver through me that felt dangerously like surrender. "You answered the wrong call, little bird, and now you are in the game. There is no walking away, there is no going back, there is only staying alive, and the only way you do that is by staying exactly where I put you." Just then, the lights in the penthouse flickered and died, plunging us into absolute darkness, and the red emergency lights of the building's security system began to pulse, bathing the room in the color of blood. "They're here," Draven whispered in the dark, the sound of a gun being cocked echoing in the silence. "Stay behind me and pray that your luck hasn't run out, because tonight, we hunt." The transition from the oppressive silence of the penthouse to the visceral, suffocating chaos of the underground garage felt less like a physical movement and more like a descent into one of the lower circles of hell, where the air was thick with the smell of gasoline and the ominous, heavy quiet that precedes a detonation. Draven's hand was a vice around my upper arm, guiding me with a bruising urgency through the shadows toward the waiting armored SUV, his body moving with a lethal fluidity that suggested he had anticipated this violence long before the lights had even flickered overhead. We threw ourselves into the back of the vehicle just as the heavy steel gate of the garage began to grind upward, and the moment the doors locked with a resounding thud, the driver slammed his foot onto the accelerator, propelling us out into the rain-slicked streets, with a force that pinned me against the cool leather of the seat. Outside, the storm had transformed the city into a blurred watercolor painting of neon and gray, the rain lashing against the bulletproof windows in angry sheets that distorted the world, making every headlight look like a threat, and every shadow look like a gunman lying in wait. Draven was not looking at me now. His attention was entirely focused on the side mirrors and the road ahead, a gun resting casually, yet terrifyingly in his lap, his knuckles white as he gripped the handle, radiating a tension that filled the confined space of the car until it felt like the air itself was pressurized and ready to explode. I wanted to ask him where we were going, to demand to know why people were trying to kill me for a ledger I had never seen. But the look on his face, a mask of concentrated, cold fury, silenced the words in my throat, leaving me to clutch the edges of the stolen coat and pray that the armor plating of the car was as thick as it looked. We were speeding through an industrial district, the streetlights flickering overhead like dying stars, when the world was suddenly and violently upended by a massive force that slammed into the passenger side of our vehicle, a bone-jarring impact that sent the heavy SUV spinning across the wet asphalt like a child's toy. The sound was deafening, a cacophony of screeching tires and crunching metal that seemed to vibrate through my very skeleton, and for a terrifying, elongated second, gravity lost its hold on me as the car tipped precariously onto two wheels before crashing back down with a force that snapped my head back against the headrest. Before I could even process that we had been rammed, before I could draw a breath into my crushed lungs, the window next to my head spider-webbed into 1,000 opaque fractures as a hail of bullets erupted from the darkness, the sound like gravel being thrown against a tin roof, relentless and terrifying. "Get down!" Draven roared, his voice cutting through the ringing in my ears as he threw his heavy body over mine, crushing me into the leather seat, shielding me with his own flesh and bone as the car continued to rock under the assault of automatic fire. I was enveloped by him, surrounded by the scent of sandalwood and danger, feeling the rapid, powerful thud of his heart against my back as he returned fire through the gap in the front seats, the deafening boom of his handgun exploding right next to my ear. I was paralyzed by a fear so primal it erased all thought, reducing me to a trembling animal hiding beneath the body of a monster who was currently the only thing keeping me from being shredded by the gunfire tearing apart the night. The driver was shouting something unintelligible, the car engine whining in protest as he tried to maneuver the wrecked vehicle out of the kill box. But the tires spun uselessly on the slick pavement, trapping us in the crossfire. Through the sliver of space between the front seats, past Draven's shoulder, I could see the rain-soaked street illuminated by the flashing muzzle flares of our attackers, who were advancing on the car with the confidence of executioners. Panic clawed at my throat. But amidst the chaos, my eyes, trained to spot the tiniest imperfections in centuries-old manuscripts, to see the things that others missed, caught a flicker of movement that didn't belong to the men on the street. High above, on the rusted catwalk of an abandoned factory overlooking the intersection, a faint, almost invisible glint of red light pierced the rain, steady and unmoving, aimed not at the driver, but directly at the spot where Draven's head was currently exposed as he leaned up to fire. It was a laser sight, a silent, deadly promise from a sniper who was waiting for the perfect shot. And in that split second, time seemed to slow down, the noise of the gunfire fading into a dull roar as I realized that the man shielding me was seconds away from having his skull shattered. "Draven, move!" I screamed, the sound tearing from my throat with a ferocity I didn't know I possessed, and without thinking, without weighing the consequences of touching a man like him, I reached up and yanked purely on the collar of his shirt, throwing my weight backward to pull him down. He didn't resist, perhaps sensing the urgency in my voice or perhaps simply thrown off balance by my sudden action, and he crashed back down onto me just as a high-caliber round punched through the reinforced glass, exactly where his head had been a millisecond before, the bullet embedding itself in the opposite doorframe with a sickening thud. The car filled with the smell of pulverized glass and hot lead, and Draven froze, his face inches from mine, his dark eyes wide with the realization of how close death had just come to claiming him. For a heartbeat, we just stared at each other in the dim, chaotic light of the interior, his heavy breathing mingling with my own, the adrenaline coursing through our veins creating a strange, electric connection that bridged the gap between captor and captive. He looked at the bullet hole, then back at me, the cold, calculated mask slipping for the first time to reveal something raw and intense, a mixture of shock and a grudging, dangerous respect. the roof, I gasped, pointing a shaking finger toward the factory. There's a sniper on the roof. The red light. I saw the laser. Draven didn't hesitate. He shifted instantly, bringing his gun up and firing blindly but with calculated suppression toward the roofline, while simultaneously barking an order at the driver to reverse. His voice devoid of fear but thick with a new, terrifying resolve. The driver finally found traction, and the SUV lurched backward with a groan of tortured metal, spinning around and tearing away from the ambush site, leaving the gunman and the sniper fading into the rain-swept darkness behind us. We sped through the city streets, the shattered car rattling and wind howling through the broken windows. But inside, the atmosphere had shifted irrevocably. Draven pulled himself off me but didn't move to the other side of the seat, staying close, his eyes scanning my face as if seeing me for the first time. I wasn't just the girl who answered the wrong phone call anymore, the liability he had to drag around. I was the woman who had seen what he missed, the woman who had just saved the life of the king of the city. He reached out, his hand brushing a shard of glass from my hair, his touch lingering on my cheek, his thumb tracing the line of my jaw with a roughness that made my breath hitch. The adrenaline was still spiking in my blood, mixing with the terror to create a heady, confusing cocktail of emotions that made me lean into his touch rather than recoil. "You have sharp eyes, little bird," he murmured, his voice rough with the residue of violence, the nickname sounding less like a taunt and more like an endearment now. Most people would have closed their eyes and screamed, but you watched and you acted. "I didn't want to die," I whispered, my voice trembling as the shock began to set in. "And I knew if you died I wouldn't last 5 seconds. "True," he agreed, his dark eyes dropping to my lips, the intensity of his gaze making the air in the car feel hotter than the fire we had just escaped. "But you saved me, Sienna, and in my world a debt of blood is a bond that cannot be broken." The car swerved sharply, turning down a narrow, unlit alleyway that looked like the entrance to a wasteland, and I knew we weren't going back to the tower, nor were we going to any place of luxury. We were going underground, into the trenches of his war, and as I looked at the man beside me, blood on his cheek from a graze I hadn't noticed, gun still in his hand, eyes burning with a dark promise, I realized with a terrified thrill that I was no longer just a passenger in this nightmare. I was his partner in survival. The safe house was a wretched, hollowed-out carcass of a motel room situated on the bleeding edge of the city limits, smelling of stale cigarette smoke, industrial bleach, and despair, a stark and violent contrast to the marble fortress we had just fled. Yet as the heavy deadbolt clicked into place with a sound like a prison door sealing shut, it felt strangely like the first honest place I had ever stepped foot in, because here, amidst the peeling wallpaper and the flickering neon sign buzzing outside the window, there were no illusions of safety, only the raw, unvarnished reality of survival. Draven released me the moment we were inside, his body sagging slightly as the adrenaline that had sustained him through the ambush finally began to recede, revealing the exhaustion etched into the harsh lines of his face, and the rivulet of dark blood that was still tracing a sluggish path down his cheek from the sniper's graze, a crimson testament to how close we had both come to being extinguished. My hands were shaking uncontrollably, trembling with a violent aftershock that rattled my teeth. But when I looked at the wound on his face, the face of the man who had kidnapped me, threatened me, and then shielded my body with his own while bullets turned the world into shrapnel, I felt a strange, magnetic pull that overrode the terror and compelled me toward him. I moved into the cramped, dimly lit bathroom to wet a rough, threadbare towel under the tap, the water running cold and rusty for a moment before clearing, and when I returned to the main room, Draven was sitting on the edge of the sagging mattress, his gun placed on the nightstand like a religious artifact, his head in his hands as he stared at the floor with a focus that suggested he was replaying the ambush frame by frame. He didn't flinch when I approached, didn't reach for the weapon, but simply allowed me to step between his spread knees, his dark eyes lifting to meet mine with a heavy, simmering intensity that made the air in the small room feel thick enough to choke on. I reached out, my fingers hovering for a fraction of a second before pressing the damp cloth against his cheek, cleaning away the blood and grit with a tenderness that I couldn't logically explain. A gentleness that belonged to the woman who restored fragile pages, not the woman who had just helped a mafia boss escape a hit squad. "You could have run," he rasped, his voice a low rumble that vibrated against my chest, his hand coming up to wrap around my wrist, halting my movements not with force, but with a firm, grounding pressure that tethered me to him. When the car stopped, when the shooting started, you could have opened the door and disappeared into the rain, and I would have been too busy killing them to stop you, yet you stayed, Sienna, and you pulled me out of the line of fire. "You would have caught me," I whispered, the excuse sounding flimsy even to my own ears, because we both knew that in that chaotic moment, freedom had been a possibility. But I had chosen the cage because the monster inside it was the only thing that made sense in a world gone mad. And besides, if I had run, they would have hunted me down eventually, because I answered the phone, and as you said, once you pick up, you're in the game whether you know the rules or not. He stared at me, his thumb tracing the delicate skin of my inner wrist, feeling the frantic pulse beating there, and a dark, possessive smirk curled the corner of his mouth, transforming his face from weary to dangerous in a heartbeat. "You aren't just in the game anymore, little bird. You changed the board completely tonight because by saving me, you declared a side, and the Russos will not forgive a civilian who interferes with their king-killing." He pulled me closer, the movement sudden and fluid, until I was pressed against his chest, the damp wool of the stolen coat friction against his shirt, and I realized with a jolt of terrifying clarity that I didn't want to pull away. The silence of the library, the smell of glue, the lonely nights with my books. All of it felt like a black and white movie I had watched a lifetime ago, while this moment, with the neon light painting stripes of red across our skin and the scent of gunpowder clinging to us like perfume, felt vivid, technicolor, and undeniably real. I had spent my life preserving the stories of others, mending the broken spines of history. But tonight, I had written a chapter of my own in blood and broken glass, and the adrenaline coursing through me was a drug I hadn't known I was addicted to. "I can't go back, can I?" I asked, the question hanging in the air like smoke. Not a plea for reassurance, but a statement of fact that I needed him to confirm. "My apartment, my job, my life, they're all gone, aren't they?" Draven stood up, towering over me, his presence filling the room and blotting out the rest of the world, and he reached into the pocket of his jacket to pull out a sleek black smartphone, brand new, utterly untraceable, holding it out to me like a key to a cell or a scepter to a kingdom. "Sienna Rain, the antique restore, died the moment she put on that beige trench coat and walked into the rain," he said, his voice solemn and final, stripping away my past with the ruthlessness of a surgeon removing a limb to save the body. "The woman standing before me is someone else entirely, someone who sees the snipers on the rooftops, someone who doesn't flinch at the sight of blood, and someone who belongs to the Kale Syndicate now, not as a prisoner, but as a keeper." "A keeper of what?" I breathed, staring at the phone in his hand, terrified to take it, and terrified to refuse it, knowing that my fingers were already itching to grasp the device that would seal my fate. "The ledger you were accused of stealing is gone, lost with V in the river," he explained, stepping closer until his body heat radiated into mine. "But secrets are the currency of my world, and I need someone who notices the details, someone who can look at a broken thing and see how to put it back together, someone who I can trust to watch the shadows while I watch the light." He took my hand and pressed the cold metal of the phone into my palm, curling my fingers around it one by one, sealing the pact with a touch that seared my skin. "The Russos think you are my informant, my greatest weakness, so we will let them believe it, and we will use that belief to draw them out and crush them. But to do that, you have to stay by my side, not behind me, not beneath me. but with me. I looked down at the black device, seeing my own reflection in the dark screen, disheveled, wild-eyed, and unrecognizable. And I realized that the fear I had been carrying wasn't just fear of death, but fear of the darkness inside myself that had risen to meet him. I wasn't the victim of a wrong number anymore. I was a participant, a collaborator, and as I looked up into Draven's abyssal eyes, I saw the future stretching out before us, violent and uncertain, but infinitely more alive than the safe, gray existence I had left behind. "I'm not running," I whispered, the words sealing the door to my old life forever. Draven nodded, a look of profound satisfaction settling over his features, and he stepped back, putting distance between us for the first time in hours, walking to the far side of the room where the shadows were deepest. He didn't speak, didn't offer a comforting lie or a promise of safety he couldn't keep. Instead, he simply lifted his own phone to his ear and tapped the screen. Suddenly, the phone in my hand vibrated, a sharp, demanding buzz that echoed the moment in the alleyway that had started this entire nightmare, and my heart skipped a beat as the screen lit up with a call from the Reaper. I looked across the room at him, seeing him watching me with a predator's patience, waiting for me to make the final choice, to voluntarily pick up the line and accept the consequences of my curiosity. I slid my thumb across the screen and brought the phone to my ear, my eyes locking with his across the expanse of the grimy motel room, bridging the distance with a connection that was stronger than steel and hotter than blood. "Welcome to the family," his voice whispered through the speaker, intimate and terrifying, echoing in my ear and in the room simultaneously, surrounding me, claiming me, and promising that while the world might burn around us, I would never have to walk through the fire alone again.